Okay, hello everybody. My name is Đào Hương Trà, and I am from the University of Languages and International Studies, Vietnam National University from Hanoi, Vietnam. Today, I'm very happy to be here, and I am going to present my study on how low proficiency students engage with teacher feedback in an EFL class. First, let me introduce about the rationale of my studies. As you all know, teacher feedback on students' writing is a very crucial part of any writing classes, but the way that learners respond to feedback or their engagement with feedback is deemed to be of even more importance. In 2010, Ellis introduced a multifaceted framework with three major dimensions for examining learner engagement: cognitive, behavioral, and affective. However, most studies of Vietnamese students' responses to feedback have only focused on just one or two dimensions of engagement instead of all three, and none studies have shed light on how low proficiency students handle teacher feedback. That is why in my study, I aim to explore the ways in which low proficiency Vietnamese learners at a tertiary level EFL writing class engage with teacher feedback on their compositions. My research question is, how do low proficiency students engage affectively, behaviorally, and cognitively with teacher written feedback on their writing compositions? For the theoretical framework of my studies, I used the framework of Ellis in 2010, and according to Ellis, learner engagement means how learners respond to the feedback that they receive. And this construct, there are three sub-constructs here in learner engagement. As you can see on the screen, they are cognitive, behavior, and affective. So for cognitive, it means how students attend to the feedback, the depth of processing, their cognitive operations, and their metacognitive operations. For the behavioral aspect, it means what students do after receiving teacher feedback, how they revise or their revision operations, and what they do, like revising strategies. And lastly, we have the affective dimension. It's about how students respond emotionally. So basically, it's about their emotions towards the feedback and their attitudes towards feedback and towards the revision process. Okay, the next part, I'm going to talk about methodology. My study is a qualitative case study, and I used the multiple case study design to answer the research question. I used this design because engagement is a very complex construct with a lot of dimensions and sub-dimensions. That is why I want to use multiple case study to gain rich and detailed information about each dimension of student engagement. The context of my research is at a first-year English for academic purposes course for major students at a university in Hanoi, Vietnam. In this course, the student has to do a writing portfolio in which they have to write 3 paragraphs for each writing entry. They first write draft 1 themselves and got peer feedback. Then they write draft 2, receive teacher's feedback, and then write draft 3 by revising draft 2. A class by a non-native teacher, Miss Minh Anh, is where I conducted these studies. So this teacher gave feedback on both the content and the language aspects of the students and asks the students to write 3 drafts. In terms of the participants, there are 4 low-achieving students. Thu, Huyền, Dinh, and Nga. All the names here are pseudonyms. They were recruited based on previous writing scores, the teacher's recommendation, and their agreement to participate in all stages of the study. a similarity between them, other than the fact that they are low proficiency students, is that they have very little or even no prior experience with academic writing back in high school. Okay, as you can see here on the screen, this is my data collection procedure. The procedure lasted for 4 weeks. In week number 1, the student wrote draft 1. They got peer feedback on draft number 1. In week number 2, they participated in the first interview. The researcher conducted the first interview with them in Vietnamese, and then they wrote draft 2 and submitted draft 2 to the teacher. In the following week, week number 3, the students received teacher feedback on draft 2, and then they also did an oral report to the researcher. And what they do here is that they talked about their feelings and talked about how they understood the feedback on their writing immediately after receiving the comments from the teacher. After that, they submitted a copy of the commented on draft 2 to the researcher. The researcher collected the draft 2, and then the students went home and they wrote the final draft. In the final week, week number 4, the students submitted a copy of the final draft to the teacher. And also the researcher will collect a copy of that final draft. And the students participated in the second interview with the researcher. In here they reflected on the whole process, how they felt, what they did, and how they understood the feedback. And so when I got all the data for the drafts, I did some textual analysis. I coded the comments, I coded the changes by the students to identify their responses to the comments and the feedback from the teacher. For the oral reports and the interviews, I recorded them, transcribed them, and translated them into English. And next, I coded them. I coded all the transcripts along the affective, behavioral, and cognitive dimensions and the sub-dimensions. And this framework was adopted from Han and Highland 2015. Basically, this framework is still the same as Ellis, but it was adopted so that it was more suitable for written feedback on students' writing. Okay, now let's move on to the most important part of the presentation, which is the findings. The first dimension I would like to present here is the affective engagement dimension. So let's talk about their emotions, right? All the students in my study expected the outcome due to their very low expectations about themselves and their self-perception as not good writers. They accepted that all the feedback that they received were a part of the assignment. However, because they received a high number of errors, some of them were a little bit overwhelmed. Like Huyen here, she shared that she was overwhelmed because there are so many things that she needs to fix. And according to Marfoot and Pearson, too many comments from the teachers actually may be discouraging, and students may even feel offended sometimes because all of their insufficiencies are pointed out. However, they still appreciated the teacher's hard work in giving them the feedback, and they did acknowledge the merits of the feedback in identifying their strengths and their weaknesses. And this is similar to some of the previous studies in that EFL students want to receive teacher feedback, and they appreciate that a lot, and they often prefer teacher feedback than other sources. However, my students also showed some negative attitudes in that they think that the feedback, and the revision process can be time-consuming, and that the negative comments can affect their mental health. Okay, next, we will look at cognitive engagement. So how students understood the feedback. In terms of the level of understanding or processing of the feedback, the students here in the study only understood under 40% of the feedback received. A lot of the explanations were very vague. Around 50% of their explanations of the feedback was not clear. And they just say things like, the feedback was like hard to understand, maybe, or my writing was hard to understand, probably, so that maybe that's why, etc. Cognitively, it is known that learners' abilities to notice or understand errors are often linked with their language proficiency and feedback literacy. So that is why the low proficiency students in my studies had a lot of trouble with understanding the feedback from the teachers. Moreover, in terms of cognitive operations, this aspect was also a little bit limited in general, even though they did show some efforts in retrieving the grammatical rules to make sense of the teacher feedback. In the oral report, they still showed a lot of struggle with their explanations. They also used Vietnamese and English translation during the revision process at home, trying to translate some phrases that they wanted to include in their writing into English. But of course, a lot of this was not effective due to their very limited level of language. And when they encountered different problems, they just replaced the problematic texts, the text that the teachers pointed out, without really looking into the reasons why. So this result is very similar to the low proficiency students in some previous studies. What about metacognitive operations? Well, for this, Duyên and Nga, so two participants, they actually planned to strictly address teacher feedback. However, for Thu and Huyền, they could not really elaborate their approach. They just say, yeah, not really a plan. I just tried my best until I was satisfied. Yeah, and that's it. And the majority of the participants, they did not proofread or evaluate the final product at all. Well, according to Alan in 2015, in out-of-school settings, individuals need to acquire the ability to regulate their own study process. And that is why instruction on the revision at home is very necessary. Okay, last but not least, we are going to look at the behavioral engagement of the students. So, after analyzing the two drafts by the students, I can see that no errors were left unattended. It means that the participants did put quite a lot of efforts in their revision. However, the success rates were not very high. It was only 10% for Huyền and 30% for Thu. For Duyên and Nga, the rates were a little bit higher at around 50%. In terms of the revision operations, only Duyên followed the teacher feedback very closely, whereas the other three students preferred using substitution or deletion. What does it mean here? It means that because of the high number of errors that they received on their draft, they decided to just rephrase or completely replace the ideas, the problematic ideas that the teachers pointed out, instead of fixing those ideas, because it was really difficult for them to understand, let alone, to figure out how to fix them. All like they didn't know how to fix the minor grammatical errors and also the bigger content errors. Okay, and in terms of the revision strategies, they did use some online sources like sample essays, news articles, dictionaries, etc. However, some of them failed to use these sources effectively. Like Thu, she used Google Translate, but then she ended up not remembering what the translated sentences mean. Some other students, like Duyên, she asked her sister, but again later she failed to explain the changes that her sister helped her with. And the others did not consult anyone because they believed that revision is their own responsibility. And also, they did not have very good relationships with their peers and their teachers. So we can see here that the presence of ineffective revision strategies actually is not very surprising, since the students rarely receive any training on how to act on the written feedback. So we need to instruct the students on how to use the resources more effectively. Okay, so what do my findings here mean? I have a few implications here to suggest to all the teachers out there. First of all, the teacher should adapt their feedback to suit the proficiency levels of the students. For example, they can provide the feedback in students' mother tongue, or just focus on certain main issues instead of giving unfocused feedback, in order to avoid students feeling overwhelmed or negative about the feedback they received. Some students may hesitate to seek help from the teachers. That is why teachers need to understand students' backgrounds, feeling, motivation, in order to deliver better, more effective feedback. Also, teachers need to create opportunities for discussions to gain better insights into student engagement. They can do this by holding regular interviews, doing surveys, or offering one-on-one consultation sessions. And last but not least, very importantly, teachers need to instruct students on how to revise effectively. This can include instructions on planning, on using external resources appropriately, etc. Of course, my study still has several limitations, including the small number of participations. So this suggests that in the future, maybe a larger pool of participants is good. Also, my study only examined one cycle of revision. This cannot indicate how students engage with different types of writing or how their engagement evolves over time. So further research may consider a longitudinal approach. And finally, all participants in my study are from the same class, taught by the same teacher. So that means in the future, studies can be conducted in different pedagogical contexts. Okay, so that is the end of my study. Thank you very much, guys, for watching the video. Please leave the comments below if you have any questions, and I will try my best to answer to you immediately. Thank you very much.